Hi, boys and girls. I hope you're having a great day, and I hope you enjoyed your long weekend. Yesterday, we didn't have school because it was a holiday. It's President's Day. Do you know why we celebrate President's Day? President's Day is a day that is set aside to honor our presidents. In America, we have a lot of holidays that are designed to honor great leaders who show courage, honesty, and bravery. And a few of our presidents, two of our most famous, the first president, George Washington, and our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, have February birthdays. So a Monday in February is set aside to honor all presidents. Now, we've had good and bad presidents. And what you think about the president probably depends on what you think is important for our country. I'm going to read today about the very first president, George Washington. I'm actually related to him. Now, George Washington did not have children, so I'm not directly related to him, but I'm related to his mother, which makes him related to me. And so it's kind of an interesting case. He was a very tall man, and he was known for being honest. You know, America just wasn't always here. And you guys know, we talked about how in the time of Columbus, there were explorers who were sailing the world and who would run into America. And then once Columbus came, you know, it became more well known that this land was here in the middle of the ocean. So people from these countries in Europe started coming to America, and even places in China were coming around the other side and landing in the California area. The countries that we know the most about are England, France, and Spain. When I was growing up, we talked a lot about how England came and France came and Spain came. I didn't learn as much about the Chinese, but I do know that there were people that came from China that came to America as well. You know, England is part of the United Kingdom here. England owned all this land here. I'm going to show you America. The different countries came to different parts of the country, our country. But at the time, it wasn't America. It wasn't the United States. It was just colonies from other countries. So back in those days, this land through here was part of England. Down here in Louisiana, you had a lot of people from France. And then down in Mexico area, you had a lot of people from Spain coming. And we have a lot of different cultural things because of that. There are people in New Orleans who have accents that sound a little different, and they also speak French a lot of times, just like in parts of Canada where the French settled. There are people who speak French there. Now, English is the language of England, and so this whole part of what is now America belonged to England, and that's where the history of America really starts. Long, long ago, there were lots and lots of people coming to this country, and many of them had been here for many years. Some of my family had been here since this time, or before this time. You had people from Germany, you had people from England, you had people from Ireland, all kinds of different countries, but they settled in these areas, which were colonies of England. And so that land was owned by the country England. The thing is, because England owned that area, England had control over the laws of that land. Now, we pay something called taxes. What that means is when I get my paycheck, because this is my job, they take some of the money that I earned and they give it to Indiana, and some of it they give to the United States, and that money goes to pay for police officers and roads and also for bridges and schools and libraries and all of those things that everybody gets to use. Those are the things that my taxes pay for. Well, back then, all of the tax money from the American colonies went to England. And the King of England, King George, he got to decide how that money was spent. Well, you know that today we vote and choose our leaders. And then we get to help decide what laws our country has. Well, back then, because the American colonies were all the way across the ocean from England, Americans did not get to decide, and they did not get to say how the money was spent. And so the American colonists began to get angry. Why did they have to have a king telling them what to do when they didn't even get to make a decision about how their money was spent? It is called taxation without representation. And what that means is that other people are deciding how their tax money is being spent without letting them have a voice or say anything to help make the decisions. So at that time, there was a war. The British soldiers came from England, and the colonists in America fought with them to win their freedom, to become their own country. And the American colonists beat the British soldiers. They had some help from France. The country France came and helped Americans. But they won. And then we became the United States. And the year that happened was 1776. And during that time, we decided that we weren't going to have kings in America. We were going to have a president. And the first president chosen was George Washington. He had been a soldier in the war. He had been the soldier who led the war, who helped the colonists win against the British. So people thought he was pretty awesome, pretty brave. And he was also known to be really honest. So we're going to read about George Washington. I'm going to bet that you've seen his face before. George Washington is on the $1 bill, and he is also on the quarter. There's a state named for him, Washington, and the capital of our country is in Washington, D.C. So let's read and find out about George Washington. Now this is a nonfiction book, and you see a table of contents. Who was George Washington? George Washington was the first president of the United States. He was a farmer, a soldier, and a hero. He helped America become a free country. This is a portrait of George Washington. A portrait is a picture or painting of a person. And you can see George on the quarter here. Excuse me. Growing up, George was born on February 22nd, 1732, on a farm in Virginia to a large family. He spent much of his time with his older brother Lawrence. Lawrence lived on a plantation called Mount Vernon. He was an army officer. George wanted to be just like him. A plantation is a large farm that grows plants for food and clothing. That's a fact. George Washington owned more than 30 foxhounds during his lifetime. George Washington grew Mount Vernon into a large plantation. It had 8,000 acres of land. And then his brother, Lawrence Washington, was 14 years older than his brother. So George was young compared to Lawrence. Teaching himself. When George was 11, his father died. He had to stop going to school to help at home. But George read a lot and taught himself. When he was 17, he got a job measuring land to make maps. Measuring land was called surveying. It was an important job, and George did it well. So when you buy a house, there's a certain amount of land that comes with it. And they have to measure the land to know where your property, your land starts, and where someone else's starts. George was brave and strong. He was very good at riding horses. This helped him become a great soldier a few years later. When George was just 23 years old, he was asked to lead the Virginia soldiers. This is a portrait of him in uniform. Now, George was from Virginia, and this part here, this green state, is Virginia. Now, back then, it wasn't a state. It was just a colony, and I have a map of that now. Becoming a leader. In the 1700s, America was not yet the United States of America. It began as just 13 colonies. They were ruled by King George III in England. People came on ships to live in America. They wanted more freedom than the king would give them in England. So here are the 13 American colonies. You'll recognize the names: New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New York, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So the dark green is the part that is owned by England. This light green is not. And if you look here, the whole Atlantic Ocean is here, and here are the colonies, and here's Great Britain. It's a long ways away. This is King George III, who ruled England for 59 years, and England is part of Great Britain. Wales and Scotland are also part of Great Britain. And then down here it says colonies, was what America's first 13 states were called before America became independent or free from Britain. In his time, many things were different in the 1700s. Home. Many colonists lived on farms and built most of their own houses and furniture. They used homemade candles to light their rooms. There was no electricity then. Hadn't been invented yet. And so if they needed light, they needed to use candles. Food. Let me try to fix that lighting. Sorry, guys. Most people grew their own vegetables, such as squash and peas. They hunted animals such as deer and rabbits for meat. They couldn't go to the stores because there were no stores then. Staying in touch. There were no telephones. People used feather pens and ink to write long letters. The letters took weeks to reach the other person. So this is a feather, and they dip the feather into the ink, and then they write, and when the ink's starting to dry up, they dip it again and write some more. Chores in school. Children helped with farm chores. Most children did not go to school. They learned to read and write at home. Mount Vernon. Sadly, when George was 20, his brother Lawrence died. Later, George became the owner of Mount Vernon. In 1759, George married Martha Custis. They were happy together at Mount Vernon. Fun fact, or that's a fact, George Washington did not have a middle name. Martha Custis and George Washington married 10 months after they met. So Martha Custis became Martha Washington. The making of a hero. In the 1760s, there was trouble coming. King George III made the colonists pay extra money for tea and other supplies they needed. The colonists didn't think it was fair. They were angry. This picture shows an event called the Boston Tea Party. To show they were unhappy with King George III, the colonists dressed up as American Indians. They threw British tea into the Boston harbor. They wanted freedom from England. They asked George Washington to lead the American army against the British army. George Washington was a great leader. He was smart and brave, and he strongly believed in American freedom. War and Peace. The Revolutionary War started in 1775. The British thought they would win. They had more men and supplies. American soldiers didn't have enough food or warm clothes, but they would do almost anything for freedom. So the war between Britain, or England, and the United States, which wasn't the United States yet, the colonies, was called the Revolutionary War, in their own words. So these are the words that are written during those times. It was called the Declaration of Independence. It was actually written by the man who would become our third president. His name was Thomas Jefferson. And he wrote these words, and they were sent to England saying, hey, we're going to be our own free country, independent or free from you. And it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's from the Declaration of Independence. These are the words that kind of shaped our country. In our country, it was believed that all men were supposed to be created equal. And that's men and women, no matter what color. That's what it's come to mean. But back then, it really wasn't so. Only white men had freedom and could make decisions. Women couldn't vote. Black people couldn't vote. But these are the ideas behind America. And as our country has grown, we've worked to change how our country is in order to be more like these words. In 1776, America's leaders signed the Declaration of Independence. It said America had a right to be free and to make its own rules. The British didn't agree. They sent more troops to fight. Now, troops are soldiers. Revolutionary War. It was America's fight for independence from Britain, or freedom. Declaration of Independence is the statement written in 1776 that said Americans had the right to make their own decisions about their country and its people. And if you look at the date on the Declaration of Independence, it's July 4th, 1776. The 4th of July. We also call that Independence Day. Every July 4th in America, we celebrate becoming our own country and declaring our freedom from Britain. For 8 long years, the war went on. The British were tired of fighting a war far from home. The British were beginning to run out of supplies and money. Finally, they gave up in 1783. America had won its freedom, but it took 8 years. It's crazy. On Christmas Day in 1776, George Washington led his soldiers across the frozen Delaware River. They made a surprise attack on British troops the next morning. George's men won the battle. It gave them hope that they could win the war. You see all the ice in the river? I've always heard that the soldiers were poor and they didn't have shoes, and it was rough. They didn't have food to eat and they didn't have shoes. 5 cool facts about George. Number 1, he had false teeth made from things like lead and ivory. They used to say that he had wooden teeth, but he did not. Number 2, he was born on February 22nd, but today most Americans celebrate his birthday on the third Monday of that month, often called President's Day. Number 3, he liked fox hunting on horseback. One of his favorite horses was named Blueskin. Number 4, he liked cornmeal pancakes, which were called hoe cakes, with butter and honey for breakfast. Number 5, he was very tall, almost 6'3", and he had size 13 feet. Very first president. How would this new country work? In 1787, men from each state came together to write new rules for the United States. They called these rules the Constitution. So the rules for our country are the rules written in the Constitution. Then they had to choose a new leader. George Washington was elected the first president of the United States in 1789. It was a big job to unite the new country, and unite means to bring together. In their own words, George Washington's friend, Henry Lee III, said that Washington was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. He was loved. People loved George Washington. Americans have always felt very strongly about George Washington being a good person. George Washington became president on April 30th, 1789. He didn't want to be called King Washington or have people bow to him. He chose to be called president. Home again. After 8 years as president, George gave up his power. He was happy to go home to Mount Vernon again. He had many visitors. He rode his horses every day. In December 1799, George got sick with a bad sore throat. There was no medicine in his time to cure him. He was 67 years old when he died. Here's a timeline. 1732, he was born. 1749, takes a job measuring land as a surveyor. 1755, he became the leader of the Virginia Army. 1759, he married Martha. 1775, the Revolutionary War begins. 1776, the Declaration of Independence is written. 1783, the Revolutionary War ends. 1787, the U.S. Constitution is written. The rules are written. 1789, he was elected the first U.S. president. And 1799, he died on December 14th. In his honor. George Washington was greatly loved. He is the only president to have a state named after him. This is Washington State. His face is on the dollar bill, the quarter, and a U.S. postage stamp. Washington, D.C., America's capital city, is also named for George. George Washington is one of 4 presidents carved in rock at Mount Rushmore National Memorial in South Dakota. George Washington was the only president who did not live in the White House, because there was no White House. At 555 feet, the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. is the world's tallest stone structure. What in the world? It says, here are close-up pictures from George Washington's time. Use the hints below to figure out what's in each picture. Now, I'm not going to do this with you, but that's just something fun in my book. I hope you learned a little bit about our country's history. I'm going to post a video below that I used to love when I was a kid, and I hope you watch it. It may not be the best thing, but it does kind of give you an idea of what was going on during the times of George Washington.